Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the 30 by 2030, a conversation on Colorado's climate and conservation. My name is Jeremy Garnkars. I'm serving as a vice president at the Wilderness Society, and I'm based in Durango, Colorado. And we are tonight going to have a conversation about an emerging effort, better known as 30 by 30, which is really an effort focused on protecting 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030. And it's a very exciting time for a number of reasons. And there's some growing momentum around this issue, both internationally, nationally, and within the state of Colorado as well. But before we jump into the presentation and the conversation, I just want to go through a few logistics. We have a link at the bottom of the slide here where it says sign in, where you can go in and fill out a form. And that's a great way to stay connected and informed on as we move forward on these efforts. Just some Zoom logistics. I believe we will have if you have a question or thought you'd like to share, there is a word bubble, I believe, at the bottom that you should be able to enter a question or thought to, and we'll try to respond as those come up. So the run of the show for this evening, and we'll try to keep this to an hour. First, we're going to go in depth on the background of the 30 by 30 effort. With a guest speaker, we have Brian O'Donnell, who I'll introduce shortly. We'll touch on how this effort, again, is touching down domestically here in the US, and then bring it further down to how it touches down in Colorado. And then we're going to wrap up with talking about opportunities for the public to engage. Even though we're in the kind of early stages of this effort, we are expecting this to gain some steam and momentum really quickly here. And so we want to make sure we have opportunities for folks to get involved. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest, Brian O'Donnell, who's currently the director Campaign for Nature. And Brian's a close friend of mine. He too here is based here in Durango, Colorado. And he brings, I was thinking, I said over 20, but I bet it's probably closer to 30 years now, years of experience working on conservation issues in numerous ways and venues. And most recently has been working on the global Campaign for Nature, which I'll let him talk to you more about. But Brian he's got a great deal of experience working with people and members of Congress on Capitol Hill to, working with the Obama administration and the president during his term, fully understands the importance of grassroots and has experience working at that level. And now has been working most recently at the international level on conservation issues. So we're really lucky to have him here tonight to talk to us about kind of what his experience has been at the international level, and kind of start and share his thoughts about how this really starts to, how we can start to build some real momentum here in Colorado towards this really ambitious goal. So with that, Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jeremy, and thanks everyone for taking part of your Tuesday night and spending it on this really critical issue. Great to spend an evening with you. I'm going to share some slides just to give some background on what Jeremy said about the 30 by 30 effort, which is what I spend my time working on. I work for a entity called Campaign for Nature, and previously worked at the Wilderness Society, so I'm still a member and a big fan of the organization. So appreciate all of you who are working closely, and appreciate the Wilderness Society for hosting this. I want to start with why 30 by 30. Back in May of 2019, the most comprehensive review of the state of nature on the planet ever really compiled was released. More than 400 scientists from every continent got together, did an assessment of the state of nature, and released a really devastating report about where we stand on the planet when it comes to biodiversity. They said that without major action, we face the extinction of up to 1 million species, many within decades. Now, as many of you know who are scientists or people who read a lot about nature, you know that extinction happens in nature regularly. But what's different is the pace of extinctions and the causes of extinction. As you can see from the Industrial Revolution, there was always a background rate of extinction that happens throughout history. But now that rate has increased more than 100, some scientists say 1,000 times the background rate, which is causing a major acceleration in the demise of some of the even what are now common species are threatened with extinction. So if we don't act and start to address this issue, we're going to lose some of the species that we've all come to know and love. Species that are here in the United States, as well as those that are in the books that we read to our kids at night, whether it's elephants or zebras or giraffes or tigers, polar bears, things that are iconic species are all facing a grim future if we don't act soon. Also, many common things like insects are facing major declines, and the report went into extensive detail about the state of nature and the urgency of action. But it's not just the extinction that is a challenge. We talk about losing whole populations of species. Now we've also seen the abundance of species start to decline significantly. In just my lifetime, and this study's been updated, so now it's about 2/3 of the wildlife populations of many species have been diminished, especially among freshwater species. That's been especially great. We've seen huge declines in wildlife abundance. So even those species that aren't immediately threatened with extinction, they may have been common at one point, and now we're seeing major declines. So there's an urgency that we all need to do to act if we're going to address the crisis facing biodiversity. And what's causing this? Why are we facing this huge biodiversity challenge? Climate change dominates the news, and on the environmental subject. And climate change is certainly a major driver of extinction and of biodiversity loss. And it will increasingly become one if we don't address climate change. But currently, the number one driver of biodiversity decline is habitat loss. It's the growth and the degradation of land that we're seeing through the increase in agriculture, through infrastructure, road building, pipelines, industry and urbanization, all taking what was once habitat for all sorts of wildlife that has now become unsuitable for their habitat. In the oceans, it becomes more overexploitation, overfishing of certain species is causing more of the biodiversity decline in the oceans. But here on land, it's really that habitat loss. So at Campaign for Nature, we thought if we're going to address the issue of biodiversity, let's focus on that key issue. How can we stop that decline of habitat loss and ensure that there is going to be sufficient habitat to maintain that wildlife that we care about, to maintain that open space? And it's not just about wildlife, it's also all the other great things that protecting and conserving land contributes to. It helps prevent storm damages. It helps ensure that we have ecosystem services like clean water. Here in Durango, our drinking water comes from the public lands, and we rely on that healthy national forest ecosystem to provide our drinking water. In coastal states, mangroves and others prevent the worst damages from hurricanes. So protecting habitat has many other benefits. Many people hunt and fish, and we obviously all here in Colorado love our recreational pursuits. And so beyond the biodiversity benefits, that habitat protection has multiple co-benefits. It also has huge benefits for climate change, because we know that intact forests maintain carbon both in soils and in trees, as well as in wetlands, and that is going to be a key way to help have a natural solution to addressing climate change. So a big win-win in that regard. Protected areas have long been sort of talked about by conservation biologists as the cornerstone of biodiversity conservation. This is an area in which we know that if we can ensure the long-term conservation of habitat in the form of a protected area or other conserved area, we know that we can guarantee that that habitat is going to be maintained in that natural state over the long term. And so for Campaign for Nature, one of the things we've worked on with a global coalition of organizations, including the Wilderness Society, is the idea that let's try to increase the ambition for protected areas. Let's set a new global target that we can ensure that at least 30% of our lands and the world's oceans are set aside in a form of protected and conserved areas, so that we can guarantee there will be sufficient habitat. We know from scientists that if we do that 30% habitat protection, we will avoid the worst of the extinctions, and we'll have massive positive benefits for climate change. So how do we go about that? Well, Campaign for Nature and our partners have sort of three overarching objectives. The first is to set that global goal, to have the governments of the world agree to that, and we know that if one government protects 30%, that's not going to be enough. Many of you who enjoyed this fall and this summer the abundance of songbirds that were moving through Colorado, now you look out their door, most of them have migrated down to other parts, to Mexico or Panama or Colombia. And so we know that while we need to protect that habitat here in Colorado during those months where they migrate through here, we also need to make sure that their habitat in Colombia and Panama and Mexico is safeguarded. So this needs to be a global goal if we're really going to protect species, especially those that migrate across international borders. So one of our main goals, the number one goal, is to encourage this agreement of protecting at least 30%. The 30% is the floor, not the ceiling. Some places in the world can protect substantially more. The Amazon rainforest, for instance, protecting only 30% won't be enough to maintain the biodiversity of the Amazon, and much more needs to be done there. Same with the Congo Basin rainforest in Africa, or some of the key forests in Indonesia. But we do know that at least 30% is critical to start to address this major decline in biodiversity. Next overarching goal is to ensure that Indigenous peoples and local communities have a voice in this, that Indigenous peoples, especially in many countries in the world where their land tenure rights have not been addressed and secured, have a key role and have their land tenure secured in order to promote and advance conservation initiatives. And so we are working actively to make sure that can be a key component and ensure that conservation does not displace Indigenous people from the lands that they have stewarded for millennia. And then finally, funding is absolutely essential for 30 by 30 to be successful. We can't set aside protected areas and then have no money for managing them, for monitoring them, for doing the public education, for restoring areas that are degraded. So securing global funding for management of protected areas is really essential. And on the global scale, we know a number of countries that have a huge abundance of biodiversity are struggling financially. Many of these countries are among the poorest in the world, have major issues addressing extreme poverty, infrastructure needs, other healthcare needs, and can't afford many of the conservation endeavors. And so there needs to be some additional assistance from wealthier nations to help those developing nations to secure and manage the biodiversity that the whole world benefits from.
Hey, Brian, real quickly, we had a question come in about why not set the target at 50% per, E.O. Wilson.
Sure. And we've talked with E.O. Wilson, and 50% is, ideally 30% is an interim target. And I think the 30% by 2030 is the key part. If you look at where we stand right now on the planet, about 15% of the world's lands and 7% of the world's oceans are currently in protected area status. Of those that are in that status, I'd say about less than half of them are managed effectively and funded appropriately. So we have a huge job just to get the current protected area state to meet its goals. And now 2030 used to be 10 years away. Now it's about 9 years away by the time we get this goal, once we get to 2021 here. So an incredible amount of work to identify, map, get these areas designated, get management plans, and get them funded. But this is should be the minimum. I support 50%. I think we should be pushing for as high as we can. We think that that goal is something that we can secure on the global level in the next 10 years under a global agreement. We don't think right now we've got enough nations on board on 50. And in fact, if we push 50, we may end up with zero agreement right now. So our approach has been, let's push 30 for the meantime as an interim step. And then it's a 10-year plan. By the time we get to 2030, let's show that this is working and then increase it. Meanwhile, fight and defend some other intact habitats that keep that ability to get to 50 viable. But it is a good question. One other thing while we're talking about that, many have said, well, when you say protecting 30, does that mean we, destroy the other 70? And that's not the case at all. It's let's get 30 in a formal designation, and then make sure we have sustainable management for the other parts as well. So it's not pave 70% of the world's land and protect 30. It's ensure 30 is in the bank in terms of conservation, and while we're working towards greater conservation goals.
Great, excellent, thank you.
Sure. This is really a unique opportunity in that protecting and conserving land globally is one of the few things that can address multiple crises that we're facing at the same time. As we all know, we're facing a pandemic, and scientists have shown that human incursions into increasingly wild landscapes have the opportunity to unleash more pandemics in the future, and that we are in danger of having that happen. Just as here in Colorado, we have fires that used to be the 100-year fire. Pandemics used to happen maybe 100 years, and now we know these fires are happening almost every other year, these massive fires. Imagine getting in a scenario globally where we're having a pandemic like this every 10 years instead of every 100 or so. It would just be devastating to humanity. And so we need to be very careful with how we're treating nature, and conserving nature can help address and prevent future pandemics. Obviously, I talked about how it can help on the ecological crisis and the biodiversity crisis we're facing. The climate crisis has a major overlap with land use and ocean use. About 30% of the climate mitigation can happen through nature-based solutions. And then the economic crisis, we know that, and I'm going to talk about this more in a moment, that protected areas are drivers of many economic growth opportunities, especially here in the Western United States and in other countries around the world. And so we can look at increasing protection as a way to drive economic growth rather than a cost. So a way to really address multiple crises at the same time. So what do we mean when we say 30 by 30, what's included? And this is really a discussion that is just emerging, and one that all of you on this Zoom call will be able to help shape. The main thing is that these areas need to be equitably and effectively managed. That means that people have a say, that communities that historically have not been adequately included in these discussions and consulted have a say in what's conserved and how it's conserved. They need to be effectively managed. They can't just be put on paper and ignored and then not and claim to be protecting biodiversity, but not have real plans or not be delivering. On a global scale, indigenous and community conserved areas will count towards 30 by 30, as will other effective conservation measures, which could include private land conservation, former military bases in areas that have intact habitat that aren't necessarily national parks, but have a major habitat conservation component. And know that this the target on the 30 by 30 internationally is a global target. So that means that not every country can get there. The Netherlands has really developed the vast majority of its land in agriculture, and there just isn't 30% of the Netherlands that is in a natural state. So they can protect as much as they can, but then they should help other countries to secure through financial contributions or others that have more intact nature. Canada has substantially more than 30% of its land in a natural state that it can protect. Same with Brazil or others. So it's not going to be equally distributed, and biodiversity isn't equally distributed throughout the world. So there are some countries that have incredibly rich biodiversity and others that don't. Okay. So how do we secure this on a global level? Well, back at when the climate convention was signed, the climate treaty, another treaty was also signed at the same time at the Rio Earth Summit back in 1992. It was called the Convention on Biological Diversity. It doesn't have nearly as much public attention as the climate summit, but it was equally important at the time. Every country in the world, with the exception of the United States, is a party, a member of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this convention has three overarching goals that you can see there. I don't need to read them. I know people hate when you read the same bullets that are on the screen, so I'll let you on the Zoom call read them. But these three overarching goals were critical components to the convention. And this is what the now more than 160 countries have all signed on to agree to. The convention existed in somewhat obscurity for the first bit after Rio. And then the parties realized they needed a strategic plan to really safeguard biodiversity. So in 10 years ago, countries met in the Aichi province of Japan and put together what are called the Aichi targets. They put together 20 targets for how the world would safeguard biodiversity globally. And one of those targets was a spatial area plan. How much of the world's lands should be in protected area status and how much of the world's oceans. And they had kind of a dialogue, a discussion, a fight, an argument, and it wasn't really based in science. And they landed on, let's protect 17% of the world's lands and 10% of the world's oceans by 2020, by the end of this year. That wasn't, as I said, based in science. It was based on what was the best they could get there. We have come close to hitting that now that we're 10 years into those targets. We are a little over 15% on land globally and about 7.5%, 8% on the oceans. A few countries are about to make some announcements and we will get close to hitting those targets from a spatial perspective. We won't get there in terms of quality of management or in funding. But scientists have told us that isn't nearly enough of the land or oceans that are needed to address biodiversity. They said that we need a minimum of 30% and closer to 50, as one of the attendees of the Zoom call had pointed out. And so the ambition needs to be much higher and countries need to change that. So that strategic plan expires here at the end of this month. And the UN Convention on Biological Diversity is writing a new strategic plan. That was supposed to happen in October of this year, but due to COVID, we've had delays in all the negotiations and it's been delayed a full year. The host country for that is China, which will be convening that conference in October. There's one more negotiating session that'll happen on that soon. So how do we get the countries of the world to agree to that, to a new target of upping their ambition from 15% of land and 10% of oceans to 30 on each? Well, we have worked to organize countries into what we're calling a high ambition coalition for nature and people. This is right now a coalition of more than 39 countries, all throughout the world. Many countries, the entire European Union has endorsed 30 by 30, and both for the continent of Europe as well as for advocating for it internationally. Canada has endorsed it as a member of this coalition. Mexico joined just last week. And as I mentioned, we have 39 countries as part of the High Ambition Coalition. So it's a really exciting leadership coalition co-chaired by France and Costa Rica, who are helping to coordinate global leaders behind this 30 by 30 goal. And they are working with the other countries in the convention to try to get them all to sign on. This convention works in a consensus manner, so they need all of the parties in the world to agree in order to get the new targets to be 30 by 30. If they agree to that globally, each country then develops a strategic plan for how they will help meet those targets domestically, similar to what's happening on climate, but in the nature platform. So we're excited about this High Ambition Coalition. It will publicly launch this coalition. It's kind of been behind the scenes recently, but French President Emmanuel Macron has a thing called the One Planet Summit that'll be taking place in January, in 34 days from now. And they will formally launch this High Ambition Coalition with, we're hoping to get to 50 countries on board by the launch at the One Planet Summit. So hopefully if we do our job well, that'll get some global news, and you may read about it in your local newspapers or see it on CNN or in the New York Times. The good news is that as the negotiations are going forward about the Convention on Biological Diversity's next strategic plan, they've had to put together the draft negotiating document. And they call that the zero draft. This is the first draft of what will be that new strategic plan. And the fantastic news is that 30 by 30 is currently included as the new area-based conservation target for 2030. So we're in the draft, and we are, that's the best place to be. Rather than fighting to get in, now we're fighting to make sure it stays in as these negotiations keep happening. So that draft came out in a negotiating session in Rome that happened almost a year ago in February, right before COVID hit, and we were making a lot of progress. And then the global negotiations have stalled out and will resume again early next year. So great news that we're seeing progress in the zero draft, and we're hoping to land this formally in the agreement in October of 2021 in Kunming, China. Second half of October is the tentative date now when that convention will take place. Next thing I want to talk briefly about is finance. We know that the world has not spent nearly enough money to close the gap for nature. Most of the recent reports have shown that globally, there's about a $700 billion financing gap between how much is currently being spent and how much is needed to truly address the biodiversity crisis. So a massive number that needs to happen. Campaign for Nature did a specific study on the 30 by 30 component. What would it cost to adequately protect 30% of the planet for nature? And what would that mean if we did that? Would that be just a cost for nations, or would there be some economic return? This study was done by a number of economists at the University of Cambridge and some other global partners, and they determined that it was about $140 billion a year is needed to protect 30% of the world's lands and oceans. We're currently spending globally only about 24 billion, so a huge gap that's needed. But they said if we did that investment, the economic returns, once we stood up that protected area estate globally, would be 5 to 1, that we would get $5 back for every dollar we're putting in. So most finance ministers and others around the world think of protected areas as a lost opportunity to make money by harvesting the timber or mining or drilling for oil. But these economists show that if we do that investment in getting them protected and managed, that the returns that'll come through tourism, through ecosystem services, will be 5 to 1. And you can look at that study on the Campaign for Nature webpage if you want to dig into that. A separate study was done by the consulting firm McKinsey & Company in this Valuing Nature Conservation. This came out just in September. And they looked at the climate benefits, the jobs benefits, and the economic benefits of nature conservation. And they also had really impressive numbers. So I encourage you to look at the Valuing Nature Conservation study up, because that has some really great numbers globally. We're in discussion with them to see if they might think about doing just one on the US, so we can see, not just the global numbers, but what it means for here in places like Colorado. So then I want to bring this back to the United States. I mentioned that the US is not a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, but that doesn't mean that the US can't and isn't looked to as a global leader in this. The US is still an observer on the treaty. I know France and Costa Rica and others are excited to have the US join that high ambition coalition, even though we're not a party to the treaty, to help advocate for the 30 by 30 role. President-elect Joe Biden, in his campaign platform, mentioned that he supported the 30 by 30 goal as a domestic goal for conservation in the United States. And we're hoping he will also endorse it as a global goal as well. He did say in his tribal plan for supporting tribal nations in the United States that he would sign an executive order on day one, making the 30 by 30 a national target, national goal, which would mean it would be the ambition that the U.S. would commit to that. Doesn't mean that automatically on day one, 30% of the U.S. would be protected, but it means that he would set that national goal to strive to get to that point, so that agencies would support that, and that it would also be a core component of his climate plan. So that was really exciting to see the president-elect say. Separately, we've started to see this in the Democratic Party platform, and we've seen some other elected officials start to take this on. I know that several state legislatures have started talking about 30 by 30. Some Republican state legislators in South Carolina, in New Jersey have recently supported this. So it's starting to get some major traction. Try to advance my slide here. Just last month, or actually it was last month, Governor Newsom in California was the first governor to announce that the state of California would set the 30 by 30 goal as a statewide goal, both for land and coastal waters. So that was exciting to see the governor announce that, and he put forward a plan in an executive order for how nature conservation could help with climate change and what type of actions would be taken in California. And then here in Colorado, our U.S. Senator Michael Bennet sponsored a resolution along with Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico in the U.S. Senate, making the 30% a goal of U.S. land and waters. So that was pending before the U.S. Senate. Will have to be reintroduced next session. A similar bill in the House of Representatives was introduced by New Mexico Congresswoman Deb Haaland. So we're seeing quite a lot of momentum here, both on the state level. We're seeing governors do this. We're seeing state legislators consider this, and we're seeing some real momentum. I think that the key in some of these platform statements, though, by the president, by Senator Bennet, and by other governors, is that 30 by 30 is really a broad goal. And what counts in that goal and how that is implemented is really up to the citizens of the country, citizens of other countries around the world, and here citizens and local communities as to what they want to have included. There hasn't been a central hub of just one organization that's pushing this. Local community groups, mayors, small land conservancies, ranchers, others are all supporting this effort, and they're doing it in very different ways, and they're doing it from the ground up. And I think that's really critical, and that's why I'm really heartened to have all of you spend some of your Tuesday evening on this, is that you can help define what first. Show that Colorado needs to be part of this global ambition, and that we can and should play a role, that our lands are worthy of this of inclusion in this global goal. We have some of the most spectacular wildlife anywhere on the planet, and we want to see this. We want to see Colorado help lead the world in ambition. But which places and how they're managed are discussions that need to be had, and they need to be had in an equitable manner. They need to be had with communities that haven't always been included, and you can help start those conversations. And so I think as a way to start is to talk to our elected officials about the crisis facing nature. It's something that we can't ignore. I'm a parent, and I know I don't want my daughter to grow up in a world where the natural world is incredibly diminished, and where the viability of really life on Earth is threatened because of our failure to treat nature with respect. So I want to make sure that our global leaders, that our local leaders understand how important this is, and ask for them to join in this global ambition. And then I encourage all of you, and Jeremy can speak to this more, to think about ways in which Coloradans can help participate, how we can start to identify places and make sure that we're actually reaching that goal. We're not just going to set a big 30% goal and then call it good, but we're going to follow through and make sure that those areas are well funded, they're well managed, and they're open to communities to enjoy. So anyway, I've said a lot there. I'm going to take a sip of water here and let Jeremy talk for a minute and try to answer.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Brian. That's great. Thank you for that overview. I have a couple questions here in the queue I want to run by you, but before we do that, could you just talk a little bit about the role that Indigenous people play, both in what you've experienced and how you've seen things play out internationally, and then your thoughts about how that plays out, specifically in the U.S. and in Colorado?
Sure. Internationally, 80% of the world's biodiversity is on lands that are stewarded and claimed by Indigenous people. So they have done a better job in maintaining biodiversity than anyone, and yet their contributions have not been recognized by global leaders. we're still seeing in some places conservation has in some ways still continues to displace people from land. And so we need to have a new form of conservation in many in parts of the world to ensure that in the name of conserving areas, we're not seeing people pushed off their homelands and some of their activities criminalized, which is still happening in parts of the world, especially in some parts of the Congo Basin and India and in some areas of Asia. That's commonplace. I think here in the United States, we have to recognize that all of the land here in the United States was indigenous territories and not ceded, to the United States. And so many of our own parks and protected areas have a history of displacement and moving of indigenous people off of their homelands. And so we need to rectify that. We need to work closely with indigenous people, and we need to recognize that their knowledge, traditional management is something that we can learn from. I think their approach has been one that, and our public lands are really due to, these were indigenous lands before. So we have to acknowledge that. And in this era of reckoning with some of the dark parts of our past, including our atrocities committed to indigenous people, we've got to recognize that conservation was not immune to that, in some ways contributed to it. So indigenous people need to be central to this approach. They're certainly central globally. And here in the United States, they have supported many indigenous communities, this 30 by 30 initiative, and will be key leaders and partners in achieving this going forward.
Yeah, that's great. It's a really important point. Okay, I'm going to get into some questions here. So first we have Liz, who's joining us tonight. She rose to raise the point around, we were talking about the natural state, the condition of the land. And she wanted to know about programs similar to some of the NRCS programs here in the US. And, they support transformation of farmlands into riparian zones, et cetera. So how do we pull it? Or she was wondering about your thoughts on how do we pull in people who may feel pushed out of conservation programs, such as farmers?
Yeah, farmers, need and do play a key role. Like most of our protected land here in Colorado tends to be the higher elevation areas. But as we all know, a lot of the wildlife uses the valleys and the waterways, and a lot of those areas are also areas for agriculture. And so the way farmers manage their land is essential for wildlife. We need to find ways for them to see pride in that and to see that we all collectively value their contributions to conservation, and programs should reward farmers for the habitat areas that they conserve. We see that in some of the, as was mentioned by the comment, that's a program that should be increased. I think that we're seeing with a trade war with China in some of the Midwestern states, massive amounts of money being paid for farmers not to grow food because China isn't buying some of our products anymore because of this trade war. Well, there was no kind of conservation component associated with that in a comprehensive way. And imagine if we link these things in a better way and show that we're not just paying farmers to be idle on this, we're paying them to play a vital role for the sustainability of biodiversity on the planet. So there's I think a much more central role farmers can play, and they should be looked at as partners in this rather than see it as a threat to their land. They're critical to the future of this.
Excellent, thank you. All right, next question comes from Gail, who actually was at the 1993 Conference on the Parties of Biodiversity. So she was recollecting back on that conference, just noted that there were companies, corporations back then talking about seeds and the genetic material, and companies trying to patent seeds. She's wondering if there's any way to stop corporations from owning our biodiversity, through genetic materials, et cetera. She just points out that seems really wrong. And, So I don't know if you have any specific thoughts on that.
It's one of the most contentious parts. Continually, it sounds like the debate started in Rio in '92, and it's still happening now. The debate over, pharmaceutical companies or others who make some drug discovery and want to patent it, and then make major profits off of it. And other people say, is this a global good? And is nature? Can you really own this part of nature? And it is a major controversy between nations as we speak, and something that can hold up actually the 30 by 30 agreement, because of this other agreement is still being fought over. So I share that concern. It's something that is trying to make sure we don't that we value nature, but we don't necessarily just put a price on it so that it's exploited is a key thing that globally we haven't figured out. One point I'll share with that is that a major report's coming out from the UK in January. It's called the Dasgupta report, which will be the largest economic study, and shows that our economic system has to really take into the fact that we don't value nature's contributions in our economic system, and we need to find a way to do that. Because if we currently go with this system the way we're doing it, we're just going to run out of resources at some point. So how do we make sure we start to value intact nature in our economy in a way that we haven't so far?
Yeah, great point. Okay, I'm going to move on here. Come back to the finance question. It's a question related to finance and conservation funding. What role do you see for mitigation banking and similar schemes that enable developers, energy companies, State Department of Transportations, et cetera, to mitigate planned or unplanned impacts to natural resources?
Yeah, this is a real challenging issue, right? Because, take airlines, for instance. Airlines want to keep flying. They want, many of them want to be better about their carbon impacts and say, well, can we pay to offset and mitigate our climate impact by paying for the protection of nature? To a degree, that's great, right? We can get some money to nature conservation. But it also, in some ways, shows that, we can't always mitigate our way out of this. That the biggest change on the climate side is we need to reduce emissions if we're going to address the climate crisis. And even though that would bring a lot more money into nature conservation, and it is an attractive source of finance for a number of projects, we have to be clear that we're not just letting people who are contributing major causes of climate change to continue to do stuff and kind of get out of jail free card by saying, well, I'll mitigate it over here. So there can be good options for this, and it can work well, but it has to be together with an aggressive decarbonization plan that really does bring down the amount of carbon that companies and other projects are doing. Airlines right now, we haven't yet figured out other fuel sources, and people are still flying. So in the meantime, it makes sense to start, but ultimately we need to find a way to decarbonize the way we do air travel. So I'm of mixed minds on it. I certainly think in the short term that should help pay for nature, but we can't make it as an excuse to not address the drivers of climate change.
Right on. Yeah, good. All right, I'm going to move on here. Next question has to do with, wondering if you could address the paths to improving ecological value, ecosystem services, and environmental justice in developed areas, not just newly preserved areas. How can we prioritize both?
So, biodiversity, we found that we need to, I think that's a great point. We need to, if we want to protect caribou or some of these wide-ranging species, we need big, vast wild areas in Alaska and Canada and the Arctic. But some species live in very small, limited areas. We know, or like take the monarch butterfly, for instance, here, just one national park isn't going to cut it. That's like everyone's backyard is really key for this. There's talk about interstate highway strips that provide key wildflowers for butterfly migrations as well. So we do have to look at this as yes, big wild protected areas are essential, but we can't ignore the biodiversity benefits of urban areas, of places close to where people live. Most Americans, at least before the pandemic, everybody was moving to cities and we were an urbanizing nation. And most people are going to experience nature close to their cities, to their towns, in a small park, in a small area. And so we need to make sure that those areas are healthy, that they are the way we're connecting kids to nature. And if we're going to have a constituency for nature, if we're going to have the ability for people and kids to experience the outdoors and families to have healthy air and water, then we need to make sure we also prioritize those areas in more urban areas as well. So I agree with the premise of the question. We can't do one or the other. We need to do both, and realize where most Americans live and make sure there's a benefit for nature for them, and it's more equitably addressed. Most of our efforts now focus on the kind of the big wild areas, and I know the Wilderness Society and others are increasingly focused on making sure communities are benefiting as well, and that's admirable.
Yeah, in the time I've been doing this work, I think that's been one of the biggest changes, and a kind of a awakening and a recognition that we have to do both. And I believe, though I think we're still in the early phases here, that you can do both. You just have to be very intentional from the get-go. Right on. So we've got another question. Folks are definitely intrigued by the international connection here, which is great, because I think it's important for people to understand, like, this isn't just a little project that people are trying to get going here in Colorado. This has implications across the planet. The next question has to do with the CBD target, which calls a CBD target that calls for a connected network of protected areas, I believe, that is ecologically representative. Both of these are even more important given climate change. Does 30 by 30 support this?
Yes. The 30 by 30, the great thing about 30 by 30 is it's really short, right? You can say it in a tweet or a hashtag. The bad thing about 30 by 30 is that you can't fit all those sub bullets and the nuance in there. And so 30 by 30 effort supports a global system of interconnected, equitably managed and well-funded protected areas. So it is critical. We know that if we don't connect these areas, that they're going to act like ecological islands and eventually start to lose their biodiversity. They need to have connectivity between them to ensure the function. The equitably managed part is essential to make sure that Indigenous people, local communities, rights are being upheld and advanced in it. So that's key. And the well managed is critical as well. They can't just be, in a lot of the world, we call things like paper parks, where governments announce a protected area and then simultaneously lease it for oil and gas or mining or do other palm oil plantation. And so we need to make sure that it's effectively managed as well. So 30 by 30 is shorthand, but I'd say folks have a chance, go on the webpage of Campaign for Nature, and you can see what is it we mean, all those sub bullets, the efforts we support. The High Ambition Coalition, if you look at which their webpage is hackfornatureandpeople.org, also talks about what they're looking for in 30 by 30. And you can also look and connect to the formal documents we've submitted to the Convention on Biological Diversity of what we support from a specific policy standpoint. And other organizations have different approaches or some similar, and I encourage all of you, it's an international treaty, but they take individual comments. So feel free to write your own comments to the Convention on Biological Diversity and advocate there. They post them online, people read them. I've seen individual people's ideas show up in the global summary. So it is equitable in some ways.
Yeah, that's great, Brian. You're right. There are a number of organizations who have here in the U.S. who are, looking at connected networks of protected areas. Some of the scientists at the Wilderness Society have been at the forefront, along with others, of course. And we are at the Wilderness Society thinking about not only a connected network of protected areas, but a connected network of resilient landscapes, and really kind of even taking it beyond the protected area focus and really thinking about functional, resilient landscapes across the US, and really trying to figure out and really factoring in the ecological representation of those places as we think about where we invest our resources, and seeing that as a piece of a continental puzzle. And this is a new shift in perspective. We're a little late to the party, I know, at the Wilderness Society, but I think, in the last few years, we've been 5 years or so, we've been really thinking about this more and really are on the cusp of significant investment on our part, at least to start to build towards this, because we see that as a key piece to the future.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Jeremy.
All right, so next question we have from Beatrice. She wants to know, is 30 by 30 also creating policy holding industry, corporations, and beneficiaries of ecological degradation accountable?
We're trying to, because our effort is really focused on the Convention on Biological Diversity, that then sets a global plan, a global goal. And then each country then has to go and talk about how they're going to implement it. And it's at that country level where they really have the authority to hold industries accountable. That's where they can regulate. That's where they can tax, where they can define what is appropriate and not appropriate for industry to do, what areas they can operate in. So the Convention on Biological Diversity doesn't really have the authority to regulate industry. It has the authority to encourage countries to do that. So we're encouraging that to happen. If the 30 by 30 target is adopted, each country will do, as I mentioned, a national biodiversity strategic action plan. And in that plan is where they can talk about the types of activities that they're going to pursue. So, if Mexico was to do that, they could decide, we're not going to drill for oil in these places, or we're going to make sure that industry doesn't do this. Other agreements that have a bigger role in addressing industry or more on the trade agreement side of things, that's, I think, where most of those kind of issues can get resolved. The Convention on Biological Diversity, unfortunately, doesn't have much teeth when it comes to holding industry accountable for the damage it does due to these two areas.
Great. Let's see. So probably have time for another question here before we wrap up, and I'm just catching up here. Let's see. They got a. Okay. Yeah, here we go. All right. Yeah, and then maybe we'll wrap up with this question, Brian, and then any parting words, and then I'm going to do a quick wrap up before we adjourn here. So just wondering if you could say more about how 30 by 30 is focusing on biodiversity initiatives where people live. How can we leverage this campaign to continue to encourage people to move toward urbanization in order to combat sprawl and suburbanization? How can we avoid biodiversity being over there and accessible to people in urban areas? Mm-hmm. How is the 30 by 30 campaign working to make this type of conservation goal relevant to people who don't have access to large preserved landscapes? So there's a couple of different things there you could choose.
A lot there. I think it is essential that if people don't see their benefit and the benefit to their families in 30 by 30, we're going to fail. It can't be just something that's done over there to help people who don't live near them. I think we need to talk about biodiversity, and I'm guilty of this, of framing it about polar bears and tigers and things, but it's also about biodiversity is responsible for all life on Earth. It's critical for our soils, for our food. It's essential for maintaining the systems that clean our air and water. And so all of us rely on biodiversity for pollination of food, and we need to do a better job of communicating that this is not just a nice to have. This is essential for the planet, and what we take so much of it for granted in our daily lives that it isn't until we see it degraded in a huge way that we understand how important this is. But we also need to make sure the benefits of biodiversity help people locally. We know in a lot of developing countries, the benefits help tourists, from wealthy countries, but we need to make sure that those communities are seeing those benefits, especially in countries that are impoverished. Here in the United States, we need to make sure that we're also conserving areas that are close to where people live, as I mentioned earlier, because that's the constituency for this. That's what's that's showing how nature is important, and it's critical for us to maintain just high quality of life. We know that cities that have more parks and more opportunities for recreation have healthier citizens, and have aren't as oppressively hot in these summer heat waves, and do better in terms of their air quality. So we need to think about biodiversity not just as big wild creatures out in Alaska, but as essential to humanity across the globe. And that's something that I hope all of you on this call can help echo those messages. I think if you read that report that I started the call with, that IPBES, the IPBES, the report, if you Google that report, it'll come up. You'll hear about the benefits of nature to people across the globe and some of the key messages that they do that should speak to constituencies across the board, whether they are people living in urban areas or in the most remote parts of the world.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Brian, so much for taking the time this evening. It's really kind of exciting, and I'll be the first to admit, after the last 4 years, I feel like there's some light here ahead of us and opportunity, and it's important. Challenges are big, for sure. Well, I want to kind of wrap up here to make sure, don't want to keep folks on too long, and thank you all for hanging in there. It looks like, just from what I could tell, we had folks from all over the state joining. So this is a great start to something I hope that we can build off moving forward. Of course, to stay involved, make sure to copy that link down, sign up there so we can make sure to get your information. I saw a couple things come in the chat, Brian. Some folks it looks like they have quite a background and expertise in some of this stuff, and they want to help both at the international and in Colorado. So I'll be connecting you with them.
Sounds great.
Yeah, we've been doing a little bit of a push. We've been partnering with an organization called Green Corps, who's been doing some virtual organizing around the state, and they've been generating a bunch of letters to the editor around the state, as well as some constituent calls to Senator Bennett's office and Governor Polis to encourage them to continue to be leaders on this and be bold moving forward. So that's been great. We've seen some already run across the state, and there will be another letter to the editor, I guess, virtual party on Thursday. So I think if you sign up here, you can get in contact with the organizers, and they will set you up. And our goal here, to kind of bring this to a close, Brian talked a lot about the genesis of this and the importance of it, of the concept of protecting 30% of land and oceans in the next 10 years globally. And he brought it, to the US and here to Colorado. And the Wilderness Society, is focused domestically. We focus here in the United States. We have a presence here in Colorado. We see Colorado as an opportunity. I think it has a lot of important ecological places that are super important to communities for a variety of reasons. And we all know, we all love this state for a variety of reasons. And we think there's a great opportunity. So we look to continue to invest and build off of what we're doing now and this event tonight. Hope to do many more here in the coming year. We are, as Brian said, President-elect Biden has committed to doing executive order related to 30 by 30 early on in his administration, in his presidency. So we will be watching that closely, and we'll keep the public informed. And I know there are a number of current efforts underway here in Colorado to conserve land. And in fact, there's also an effort, I think it's called the Colorado Native Landscaping Coalition. There's so much space and opportunity here for so many people representing different interests to come together. And I hesitate to say this, but I'll say it. I want to see a movement. I want to build a movement. I think that's what it's going to take to get us to move the needle in a significant way, to really see real transformative change, changing the systems that some of which have led us into the situation we're dealing with now. And I think it's going to take people at all levels, at all interests, urban, rural. And if there's one thing that can bring this country together, I actually believe it is this. I believe this is if done well, could do that. So with that, I want to thank Brian for joining us, and thank you all for taking the time this evening, and look forward to working with you all in the future. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, stay safe and happy holidays.